Okay, so this is Greg Kiviat. I'm a member of the of ICEAA and a member also of the OEM COG, the cooperative the cooperative opportunities group. It's basically our objective on the group here is to identify items of interest to the OEM cost analyst community. Today we have Brian Kutz and Erica Walters to present their overview of CAPE and policy updates. So I will hand it over to Brian and Erica.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Kutz. I work in the Land and Naval Warfare Cost Analysis Division of OSD CAPE. My boss, Ms. Jennifer Bowles, really wanted to be with us here, with you here today to talk to you about CAPE and all the important things that we do. But she's got a cold and her voice just wasn't going to make it through. So I'll be covering for her today. Also with us today is my coworker, Erica Walters, who coincidentally also has a cold, but will also be giving the second part of the briefing. So first, thanks to Megan and the team for inviting us, Megan and Greg, and the team for inviting us here today. And thanks to all of you for spending your lunch hour with us. If it's your lunch hour, it's mine. I'm a little hungry. But before we get started with the brief, I'd like to start off with a couple questions just to get a feel for the audience and your experience with DoD and the DoD cost agencies. Megan, could you start the first poll for us?
Answers are streaming in. Let's just give this 5 more seconds because we got about 76% of you have voted, and it is a landslide right now. 80%, 20%, 80% of you do work with the U.S. Department of Defense.
Excellent. All right. If we could run the second poll.
Second poll, have you dealt with a US DoD cost agency? Oh my goodness gracious, that one's going up even faster. %76 voting, a similar 79, 80-20, same, just about the same split.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Megan, for those. And thanks for all of you who participated in the poll. So it looks like a large percent of you have dealt with the DoD and the cost agencies. So some of the briefing may be old hat to you, but there'll definitely be some good nuggets. So please listen closely. All right. On to slide 2. If I can get to slide 2. There we go. Okay. So the director of CAPE, Ms. Susanna Bloom, reports directly to the Secretary and Deputy Secretary of Defense and provides independent cost analysis on the department's most pressing issues. We'll focus mostly today on our cost estimation and analysis activities. But before I get into those, I did want to mention that CAPE has 3 deputates. The first is program evaluation. Their main focus is developing the president's budget each year. The next is the analysis and integration deputate. They focus on war gaming, including developing and evaluating war plans. And finally, the cost analysis deputate, where Eric and I are from, which will be the main focus of our talk today. So within DoD, CAPE serves as a principal organization for independent cost estimation and analysis. That's not to say we're the only ones who do cost estimation. Far from it. We work closely with the cost estimators in the services, but by statute, CAPE has some specified responsibilities that I'll talk about on this slide. First is one of the ones that folks most often associate with CAPE. It's the conduct of independent cost estimates and analyses. We conduct ICEs for major capability acquisitions, which is the traditional acquisition pathway most folks are familiar with. We also conduct ICEs for programs that use the middle tier of acquisition pathway and the software pathway if their funding exceeds certain acquisition category thresholds. We're also required to conduct cost analyses for programs which are seeking to use multi-year contract authority. There aren't a ton of these in the department, but before Congress will let us commit to multi-year funding for a program, which takes away some budget flexibility. They ask us to do an analysis to verify that the savings are worth the loss of flexibility. One example of those is the C-130J multi-year procurement contract. I mentioned earlier that we work with the services. Depending on the program, CAPE may delegate cost estimates to the services. For major programs, we still review those estimates to make sure that adequate funding has been identified. That review of major program cost estimates done by the services, and that we also do, also helps us support the program evaluation side of CAPE each year as they develop the president's budget as part of the programming, planning, budgeting, execution system that the department does every year. And it's getting voted on pretty soon. So for 22 anyway, we're working on finishing up 23. So in addition to all the fun cost analysis we get to do, we're also responsible for developing policies and procedures for cost estimation and analysis within DoD. Erica is the expert in this area, so I won't steal her thunder. She'll talk to you about many of those policies later on. But I will mention that we are also responsible for policies related to cost reporting and cost data collection. This is one of the first things many industry folks think about when they think of CAPE, because most major programs have cost reporting requirements. We set those requirements for what needs to be reported and how it needs to be reported. I'll talk about two systems later on, CADE and EVMS, that we use to collect data in the next slides. But before I move on to that, I'll cover these last two bullets. We provide leadership on cost education and training, not just for DoD, but for other agencies in the government and their cost analysts as well. There are about 2,000 government cost analysts, so it's quite an endeavor. We provide some of that training through CADE, which I'll discuss later, and also through our partnership with the Defense Acquisition University. And then finally, each year we provide a comprehensive report to Congress on our cost assessment activities. So that's really just a quick run through of all our cost assessment functions. I've included our public website on this slide. So if you'd like to learn more, give it a click. Okay, on to CADE. As I mentioned on the previous slide, CADE is one of the systems we use to collect cost data. CADE is the cost assessment data enterprise. For government cost estimators, I have to say this is really pretty snazzy. It's the authoritative data source we use to support our cost estimation work in the department. CADE includes actual cost data, which is easily searchable and retrievable. So as you can imagine, it really saves us a lot of time, one single place to go, and you know you've got the right data. So I mentioned it's government-only access. That's because it includes detailed cost information from many of your companies. So as you'd want us to, we carefully protect that information. But I wanted to include CADE in this brief because it also includes reporting contractors. So there are likely folks in your organization that use CADE to submit cost and software data reports on programs at your company. And importantly, I've included at the bottom their public website address. It's really a great resource, and it's open to all for DoD cost reporting policies, and also for copies of many of the documents that Erica is going to talk to you about later. I really encourage you to check it out. The next system I want to talk about is the Enterprise Visibility and Management of Operating and Support Cost System, EVMS. Again, this is a government-only system, but I wanted to give you an idea of some of the things that we're doing to support our cost estimating within the department. Congress directed us to stand up EVMS to collect and report on actual operations and support data for major weapon systems. We all know that most of a system's cost over its life cycle is in the ONS, so it makes sense for us to collect that data. I'm not saying the DoD wasn't collecting that data, but as you can imagine, and maybe from those of you who have experience with DoD, each military department collects the data differently. They collect different data and in different systems. So EVMS is being designed to pull all that data together, much in the way that CADE pulls together cost data, so that we have one central place to go for ONS data. But EVMS doesn't just serve the cost community, it also supports analysis of logistics, maintenance, human resources, and the other areas that you see on the slide. Another benefit of EVMS is it's really helping us to identify capability gaps in our current data collection systems. Until we started pulling everything together and looking at it side by side, I don't think we realized that we had some gaps in some places and different gaps in others. So this is really useful in that regard. The EVMS team actually just released its first build. I'm actually signed up for training on it next week, so I'm really looking forward to seeing the functionality. Like the other systems, I put the website on the bottom. I would tell you that this website isn't active yet. It's under construction, but it'll be there soon. Even though this is focused on government folks, I'm sure there'll be information on there for you, for industry folks, just to learn more about it. Before I turn it over to Erica to walk us through all of the policy info that's so interesting to many of you, I did want to take a moment to make a quick plug for 2 CAPE-led cost forums. The first is the OSD CAPE Cost and Technical Focus Group. This is run mostly by our CADE folks, and it provides training for folks who need to use the system to submit cost reporting data. So it's obviously open to government and industry. They provide virtual training year-round that's really top-notch. The email for that team is there, so if you're interested in any of that training or have more questions after you look at the CADE website, you can email the folks at cadesupport@techaloti.com. The second is the cost IPT. This is really a form, it's much like ICEAA and OEM COG. Really, the purpose is to facilitate discussion between government and industry, the cost communities on ideas, issues, and concerns. In this COVID environment, we've been having biannual virtual meetings, which has really been good and bad. It's given us much broader reach since folks don't have to travel. But our last meeting had broad representation across industry and government to discuss issues, ideas, concerns in the cost community. In addition to those general meetings that we have biannually, we also set up one-on-ones with each of our industry partners that participate to discuss specific concerns that they may have. So that's something that I would offer to you all. So I'm actually the POC for that one. My email is there at the bottom, Richard B. Coots, Brian, B for Brian. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to send me an email and I can add you to the list. Let's see. And let's see, I think that's all I need to cover. So I really appreciate your time this afternoon, and again for joining us, and I'd like to turn it over to Erica.
Thanks, Brian. This is Erica Walters, also from OSD CAPE. I'm going to talk to you today about policy that OSD CAPE owns or that governs the work that we do. Like Brian, I work in the Land and Naval Warfare Cost Analysis Division, and so my primary function is to do cost estimates on weapon systems, but I'm also kind of as an additional duty, the policy POC. So if we could go to slide 7, please. So this is an overarching roadmap of the acquisition authority and guidance that applies to the work that we do. Different pieces of this come from different sources, different authorities, and come with a different level of flexibility in how closely we have to adhere to them, is what I would say. So if you start at the top, that's where we get our legal authorities. So this is statute in law in Title 10 and Title 41, depending which side of the slide you're looking at. So that's really written into law, stuff that is mandatory that we have to follow, but it doesn't always have a lot of detail in terms of how to follow the requirements that are in there. And so that's where everything else on the slide comes in. So you start with law and legal requirements, and then you get through different layers of DoD directives, which are DoDDs, DoD instructions, you'll see some DoD eyes on this, and DoD manuals. So there's one kind of in the middle of the slide here. So you have directives, instructions, and manuals, and all of those tell DoD employees what they should do, how to implement the legal requirements that stem from Title 10, Title 41, or any other sections of United States Code. And so here we have arrows showing kind of how to follow through these if you were to read them sequentially for some reason, but these things collectively are thousands of pages worth of guidance. And so it can be difficult when you're new to this cost estimating world to know what piece to look at when you're looking for guidance. So this is sort of a table of contents of what's out there, but it does take a long time to go through and get familiar with the requirements. And you just kind of have to know where you're looking. If you do need to find a copy of any of these files, there's a link on the bottom left that you can use, but I actually just Google things. For the most part, you can look for something like DOD 5000.01, and the first Google result will give it to you. We also have a list of the individual Title 10 statutes on a later slide, so you can look through and get familiar with them. So I'll give you a quick overview of what's on here, and we'll zoom in on certain pieces of this in later slides. So on the left side of the slide in the orange box, that's got really the acquisition-centric DoD-Ds and DoD-Is. So that governs the entire process of acquiring weapon systems and sustaining weapon systems, not just the cost estimating piece of it. So those are kind of more overarching and broad, and CAPE doesn't own those. So the DoD 5000.01 and the 5000.02 are owned by the Acquisition and Sustainment Group. So it's really, you know, when AT&L split up into both A and S for acquisition and sustainment and R&E, which is research and engineering, they are the ones that own the left side here. So we'll get into that on the next slide. But the piece that's more directly applicable to cost estimating is in the middle of the slide in the green boxes. So stemming from Title 10, we have a directive 5105.84 that sort of establishes our organization and spells out our responsibilities. So that's a good place to start if you're trying to understand the work that CAPE does. For cost specifically, because as Brian mentioned, CAPE does more than just cost analysis, but for the cost analysis group specifically, we have DODI 5000.73, cost analysis guidance and procedures. That's really the main one that talks about the content and procedures for doing independent cost estimates, multi-year procurement cost estimates, and all other kinds of things. It also has timelines for when certain inputs are due to us for the types of estimates that we do. And it's also the source of the reporting requirements for cost and software data reports. So Brian mentioned this when he was talking about the CADE system earlier. Probably everybody on this call is familiar with CSDRs because this is the main way that we get data from contractors. And so it's in the middle of the slide, 5000.73 and 5000.04 that really go into when CSDRs are required and what kind of information is contained in them. Also on the right side of the slide, while we're talking about CSDRs, you'll see some of the other regulations that govern contractor data and how we collect it, what we can collect it on. So you have, stemming from a different section of the same US code, we have the federal, we have the FAR, which is the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and then the DoD specific version of that, which is DFARS. There's a section of that that spells out CSDR requirements specifically, and that language is actually going to be updated hopefully in the next few months. Nothing too earth-shattering, just kind of bringing it up to speed, since I think the last update had been in maybe 2011 or something like that, 2014. So you'll see not just on that, but on a couple other pieces here, we labeled which things are being updated soon or were recently updated. It's kind of a constantly evolving collection of documents. So it can be tough to stay on top of what the current guidance and policy is. But that's why we have briefings like this one to kind of let everyone know what's going on. So I'm going to go into more detail on the orange box and the green boxes, but this is kind of the last discussion of CSDRs specifically. Really, for any of these blue boxes, we could have a couple-hour conversation about the content. So this briefing is really about getting you familiar with what is out there, not so much what the content of that guidance is. So this is kind of our table of contents, and next slide is slide 8, where we'll talk more about the orange section. So this slide is the acquisition specific side of the previous one. So not just cost estimating, but all aspects of acquisition. So the basic authority stems from Title 10, which governs all federal acquisition. And then getting into DoD specific things, we have the 5000.01 and .02. So those are the overarching documents about how acquisition works. There is not a lot of detail in either of those documents, really. It used to be that the .02 was very long and talked about things like the different milestones for weapon systems. But a lot has changed over the last few years when it comes to acquisition, and ANS has really switched over to this adaptive acquisition framework. And so most of you are probably familiar with the different pathways that have split off in recent years. There's been this effort to kind of change the flexibility of acquisition so that depending on what you're buying, you can follow kind of more tailored requirements in terms of paperwork, trying to streamline things where possible. And so in the middle of this slide, you'll see a list of all the different pathways. There are 6 primary pathways right now, which are, you can see them going down, the urgent capability acquisition pathway, middle tier of acquisition, which is rapid prototyping and rapid fielding, major capability acquisition, which is the more traditional MDAP kind of process, defense business systems, which is the old MACE systems, acquisition of services, and then software acquisition. So the main ones that I have encountered so far have been the middle tier of acquisition, major capability, and software acquisition. Those have been kind of the most active ones that people have been using. And then all of them kind of come together in the one at the bottom on product support management that talks about how for the entire life cycle you manage a program, which could itself be a collection of different pathways. So everyone's still kind of getting a handle on how to use this new framework, because it used to be that everybody just followed the MDAP process. You had milestone A, milestone B, milestone C, and you know, a lot of paperwork associated with that. It's a complicated process, but everyone was following the same one. Now there's a lot more flexibility. You can have things like a middle tier of acquisition, rapid prototyping program that turns into a major capability acquisition. Or you could have a major weapon system that has a continuing software acquisition pathway throughout the life cycle as they're working on software updates continuously. And so there's a lot more variation in terms of how a program can go from start to finish now. And there are a lot of implications of that change downstream. So when we're talking about things like cost and software data reports, it is a little bit harder to write the policy for programs under all these different pathways because there's so many different ways that things could play out. So you can expect to see ongoing policy updates, at least over the next few years, probably forever, as we kind of see how programs work in this new environment. So most of the things on this slide are official DoD policies. You can see there's a DoD-D or DoD-I number associated with them. So those are pretty easy to find, you just Google them. But the Defense Acquisition Guidebook is something that's been around for a long time. It used to have, I think, maybe 10 chapters, and you know, there's a chapter on cost estimating, a chapter on analysis of alternatives and all that kind of thing. So they're updating the guidebook now, and nobody's really sure what it's going to look like, but it's mainly a collection of all kinds of other guidance. So the less official things that accompany these more official DoD-Is and DoD-Ds. We'll talk about some of the cost estimating specific ones on the next slide, but this gives you a sense of, for the overarching acquisition side of the house, what are the governing documents for these? And there are some links at the bottom to help you kind of digest this information. There's the DAU website, the aaf.dau.edu address is kind of an interactive website where you can do something like, pick the middle tier of acquisition, click on different points in the process and see what the requirements are at different stages. So that's a useful resource. And then the DoD 5000 series handbook, the long link at the bottom, has kind of a 1 or 2 page synopsis of each of these documents. So you can see where should I look for more information. So if we go to the next slide, slide 9, this has our cost estimating specific ones. Yeah, slide 9, thank you. So starting from Title 10 again, and we'll get into specific Title 10 statutes in a little bit. Everything in the green box here is cost estimating specific. So you start with 5105.84, which just talks about the responsibilities of the director of CAPE, the types of analyses that we do. And then the DODI 5000.73, cost analysis guidance and procedures, is the big cost document. So if you ever have a cost policy question, I would start with the 73. I think that's the most comprehensive cost specific one. And then there's also the DoD manual 5000.04, cost and software data reporting manual. So between the two of those, especially if you're in this particular forum because you have something to do with CSDRs, those are your two best starting points. But if you do cost estimating more generally, the guides at the bottom of the page are also very useful resources. So this tells you more about how to do cost estimates depending on what type of analysis you're doing. So we have the operating and support cost estimating guide and the DoD cost estimating guide. These are all 4 of the bottom ones here are or will be on our public CAPE website, or you can Google them. So starting on the left side, ONS is the ongoing part of a program's life cycle where you are operating and sustaining it, as you can get from the name. It talks about a standard cost estimating structure, so manpower, maintenance, fuel, continuing system improvements, things like that. There's a standard cost estimating structure with definitions for the ONS phase. So it goes into a lot of detail about different data sources that are available. Brian talked about EVMS in his portion of the briefing, which is the up and coming CAPE database for ONS cost data. So there's a lot more information in that guide about the entire sustainment phase. More broadly, for the second box on the bottom, the DoD cost estimating guide talks about generically how do you do a cost estimate. Everything from, you need to collect data, you need to normalize data, you need to analyze the data and then document it, report it out. It goes through step by step on just how a generic cost estimate comes to be. So that's a really useful guide. That one is pretty new, I think published for the first time maybe 2 years ago. And going through an update now. The third box on the bottom is the inflation and escalation best practices for cost analysis handbook. So we had versions of that in 2016 and 2017 that are up on our website, and we have a new one coming out in about a month. So over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a pretty big change in the way that the DoD looks at and calculates inflation and escalation. Most of us who learned cost estimating prior to that learned about base year and then year dollars, and you can convert base year to base year to then year to then year, etc. But things got a lot more complicated over the last few years when DoD started to recognize the difference between inflation and escalation. And it matters whether you're normalizing something for just economy-wide price changes or if you're looking at something that's commodity specific, like ships or steel or aircraft. So the upcoming handbook has a lot of step-by-step instructions about how to implement some of the theory changes that are in our previous versions of the handbook, so keep an eye out for that. I'm also the POC for that handbook specifically if people have any questions on that. And then finally, we have a brand new guide coming out soon for analysis of alternatives. So we had a new DODI that came out last year, the 5000.84, going over the requirements for an analysis of alternatives. That's something that's required, for example, for milestone B certification. So that guide talks about how to do a cost estimate in support of an AOA or how to review a cost estimate as part of an AOA. So that should be coming out in the next few weeks as well. So these are really the ones that my office has the most control over. As I said at the beginning, there are different levels of authority that come with these different documents. So at the top you have law, and then in the middle you have official DoD Ds, Is, and Ms that are mandatory for DoD employees to follow. And then at the bottom it's more handbooks about how to do things. It's not so much directly required unless there's a pointer to it in a formal document. So for example, the 5073 has a line that says that you have to follow the inflation and escalation best practices handbook. So you can kind of follow the chain of policy through it if you need to, but this is again just to give you a sense of the information that is out there. So slide 10 has an overview of the most recent updates and the ones that are coming soon. So the first 5 or so, the first 4 are recently completed updates. So we had that overarching .73 and the .04 for CSDRs are the most official ones, and those have come out in the last 2 years or so. We also had updated the ONS cost estimating guide and the DoD cost estimating guide with a new one of those coming up soon. And like I said, an update for the inflation and escalation handbook. So that's in the final stages of being published online. And same thing for the AOA cost guide. So those are all the ones that we've talked about a little bit already. And our last 4 bullets on this slide are new ones that we haven't brought up yet. So the military standard 881F is undergoing an update right now with ANS looking through comments. So the MIL standard 881, the E is the most recent one, and that came out a few months ago, maybe. So they're updating it again, and it's basically a collection of work breakdown structures. So depending on what kind of weapon system you're estimating or doing a CSDR submission for, you can look up a standard work breakdown structure there. So if you're doing a missile system, there's a missiles one. There's an aircraft system specific one, and it lists off things like different subsystems that are part of the weapon system and the categories that we would want to collect data for CSDRs. So that's the MIL standard 881 with the F coming out soon. The cost reporting DFARS clauses. So I did mention this briefly on the first slide. It's the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulations Supplement. So there's a section that says, you know, CSDRs are required. This is what you put into a contract to make sure that we collect cost data. So we have some revisions coming soon on that as well. The program resource distribution table is a somewhat newer requirement for CSDRs. So that is basically a table that shows where all of the money for a program goes. It can include prime contractors, subcontractors, government organizations that do things like ongoing integration work or testing. Everywhere that money goes for the program is listed in the resource distribution table, so we can see who crosses the reporting thresholds for CSDRs. And like I said, that also includes government entities, not just contractors. And then the last bullet on the slide for contract RDTs, so similarly to the resource distribution table for the entire program, individual contracts have this as well, just to show like if they have any subcontractors that are big enough to report directly for CSDRs. So we're updating the instructions and DIDs for those, really just trying to kind of do a spring cleaning and make sure everything is updated, especially like I went into a lot of detail on the different pathways under the adaptive acquisition framework. So now that there are so many different pathways, we have to kind of go through all of our language and make sure that everything still works and applies to the pathways the way that we want them to. There's a link at the bottom of this slide to our public website, which has copies of a lot of these things. So the official DoD Is and Ms, like I said, are easier to find on Google, but for our own cost estimating guides for the ONS and overarching inflation and escalation in the AOA, those will all be on our public reports website. Next slide, please. All right, slide 11. We've talked a little bit about Title 10 of United States Code. This is statutory requirements for cost estimating. So you can see here a list of the specific statute sections that established cost estimating requirements. The FY21 NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, renumbered a lot of the sections, and so you see here the red strikeout numbers are the old section numbers, and then you'll see the new ones. So just if you're accustomed to referencing things like 2366B certification is a big one for milestone B, just know that the section numbers are changing. But for the most part, we didn't see substantive changes for these sections, just numbers. So this is mainly for future reference. I won't go into a whole lot of detail on this now, but you can see in the underlined sections, so like third bullet down, MYP is underlined, so multi-year procurement contracts, and then cost estimation and analysis, independent cost estimates. These are the statutes that apply most to us that we reference if we get a question on things like, hey, can I submit a business case analysis instead of the analysis of alternatives for this part of the statute? And so we'll go pull up the actual language and look through what the requirements are, and that's really our starting point. These sections are all also available online. I just Googled the number. So if you type in 10 USC 221, then you'll see the language for the definition of a FIDEP, for example. The only specific one of these that I'll point out is towards the bottom. One of the newer sections was 10 USC 2441, which is now going to be 4323. So this was a sustainment review section that came out just in the last few years. Everyone's been kind of figuring out what kind of information do we want to collect for sustainment programs. And this was one of the only substantive changes we saw in the 21 NDAA, which is just to require them for every 5 years after IOC, not just initially. So like I said, I won't go into too much detail on this. The sections 3221 to 3227 are really the most cost estimate specific ones that talk about cost data collection, for example, for CSDRs. There's an EVMS statute, separate ones for milestone A, B, and C, and ONS. Non-McCurdy breaches are in here too. So it just depends what you are doing, where your program is, which section is most relevant to you. But this is just kind of a list so you know where to look for more information. And this was my last slide. So with that, I'll turn it back over for any questions.
Thanks, Erica and Brian. We did get a few questions. Everybody who has questions left, go ahead and send them in the chat box. We've got a good amount of time, so we can answer a whole lot more. The first question came actually really early, and this came from Rachel. How is CAPE addressing the COVID-19 related supply chain issues and temporary cost increases? What is CAPE anticipating in terms of generalized cost increases related to the issues facing industry right now?
That is a great question. So I would say two separate things. One of them, I talked about the inflation and escalation best practices handbook that we have an update coming out for soon. So when we do cost estimates, we account for inflation and escalation for all commodities. And so if we have a weapon system that we think is going to be particularly affected by supply chain related price increases, that is something that we would want to include in a cost estimate. So the point of doing a cost estimate is to get the most realistic picture of what something is going to cost over the long term, right? And so we'd have to make assumptions about how durable we think any price changes might be. You know, do we want to model something as a temporary spike in prices that's going to drop back to normal at some point or not? A lot of economic analysis goes into making decisions like that. And really it's all about writing things down. So writing down the assumptions that we make in cost estimates and communicating them to senior leaders so that there's definitely going to be uncertainty in topics like that. You know, we don't know what's going to happen with prices over the long term, but communicating that risk and uncertainty to decision makers is important as they go forward and decide different budget things. So I would say going through inflation and escalation best practices is one way to account for those price increases. I also know that particularly the other side of CAPE, so not the cost analysis side, but the more program evaluation, generic kind of program budget review work that CAPE does, they are looking into supply chain issues for specific categories, so different commodity groups within the economy. I'm not sure how much I can say about that specifically, but there are issue teams within CAPE that are looking at that. So thank you for the question.
Excellent, thank you. I think the next one came in as sort of more of a comment. The evmosc.osd.mil site is up and running if anyone has questions on it. So thank you, questioner, for that. The next question we got is from Karen. It says, can you clarify if the DoDDs, DoDIs, and other documents are written specifically for the government users or if they apply to OEMs as well?
So officially, the DoD Ds, Is, and Ms are the government telling the government what to do. And so an example of that would be if I look through the chain of policy for CSDRs, which start from basically DoDI 5073 and then DoDM 5000.04. Those documents are telling government people kind of how to write contracts. And so if I'm a contracting officer on the government side, then I need to follow those documents when I'm writing up the CSDR requirements that go on contract. But we can only enforce contracts on contractors, and so it's important for the actual contract language to have the requirements spelled out correctly. So we do sometimes get into situations where what goes on contract is not, it doesn't match what is in DoD policy, but it's supposed to. So yeah, DoD employees are supposed to be following the policy and putting that stuff on contract, which is what the contractors follow.
Okay, and our next question comes from Daniel. It says, wide variety of inflation indices used within DoD can vary from program to program. How does CAPE reconcile these different indices?
Great question. So first I would clarify one thing, which is the DoD has a lot of different indices that sometimes people refer to as different inflation indices, but they're actually different outlay profiles attached to them. So without getting into too much of an inflation escalation deep dive, there are basically two different kinds of indices. You have inflation and escalation. So there's only one rate of inflation for the entire economy, just by definition. It's a representative market basket of goods that the White House, OMB, analyzes and puts on their website, and there's only one, because there's only one gross domestic product for the economy. Any other index that measures any specific commodity group is an escalation index. So if I had something like an aircraft manufacturing index that's specific to that industry, that would be an escalation index, not inflation. So DoD, since we do cost estimates for so many different products, we do have a lot of different indices floating around. If you look at tools like the Joint Inflation Calculator that the Navy produces, there's also one that the Navy and Air Force use that's a macro-based thing. So you'll see a lot of different indices in all of these tools, but most of them are only inflation, even though they hide under different names. So you'll see stuff in the Joint Inflation Calculator that's labeled, aircraft index or shipbuilding and conversion index. But those are all actually inflation based. If you trace them back to the way they were calculated, they are inflation with the appropriation specific outlay profiles built in. So saying if I'm a shipbuilding and conversion funding line, I'm going to spend my money at a different rate than something like an RDT&E appropriation. But the indices that you find for the most part are inflation based, just accounting for different spending patterns. That said, there are a couple of escalation indices that you'll find in those tools, namely mill pay, civ pay, and fuel. Sometimes you'll see a healthcare escalation index, and so those are measuring those commodities specifically. But for the most part, what we have is inflation. So having said all of that, the question was, how does CAPE reconcile the use of all these different indices? The first step is to make sure that people are using the right kind of index for the analysis that they're doing. And that has been kind of an ongoing challenge, because people will see the specific names of things like, oh, this is a shipbuilding and conversion index, so it must have everything that I need for shipbuilding and conversion, without knowing that it's actually built off of only inflation, not commodity specific real price change. So we've had kind of an outreach program going for the last couple of years to try to explain that difference between economy-wide inflation and commodity-specific escalation, to make sure people first understand what type of index they're using and the implications of that choice for their cost estimate. For example, if you accidentally use an inflation index and your commodity is growing, the prices are growing at a rate faster than inflation, then you will have underestimated your costs over time. So trying to communicate that difference to people has been kind of the first phase of this. And that has been the driver for the updated handbook that I mentioned that's going to come out in the next month or so, trying to find better ways of explaining those differences and help people find the right kind of index for what they're trying to do. The next phase of that, once we get everybody on the same page with the types of indices that are already out there, what we really want to do is come up with a bigger collection of escalation indices for us to use. So we already have mill pay, civ pay, fuel, and healthcare. Those are kind of the easy ones that Comptroller publishes for us. But there are all kinds of other indices out there. You can get subscriptions to economic index sources, including the Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example, that look at commodity-specific escalation. And so trying to figure out what indices out of those sources are most applicable to DoD weapon systems is going to be kind of a big research project for us once the handbook is finalized. And it will create some challenges in terms of, if I do a cost estimate at CAPE for a ship program and I pick an index from source A, and I'm trying to compare my estimate to NAVC's estimate for the same program, and they got their index from source B, how do we compare our estimates and know that we used similar assumptions, or any kind of estimate reconciliation does become more difficult when you add all these different indices in. But it's really the way to do cost estimating, because you want to take confounding variables out of your data. So it's part of just kind of generic data normalization, that if you have a stream of costs over time and you know that the prices were fluctuating like crazy during that time, you'll want to take those fluctuations out before you start doing things like learning curve analyses, cost improvement curves, average cost factors, and you need to take that variation out before you do that. So just recognizing that the only way to get there is with an escalation index, and understanding that I might pick a different escalation index than you pick. It is going to make it harder to compare assumptions and methodologies, but that's really the way to do the analysis. And there is a section in the handbook about reconciling different estimates, just kind of some sample questions that you can ask another analyst about how they picked the index that they used and why they think that was appropriate. It's really no different from any other point of estimate reconciliation. It's just kind of a topic that people are used to treating as an afterthought, but it really shouldn't be. So kind of a long-winded answer to that question, but it is a complicated topic, and it takes a while for all of it to kind of sink into the point that you can talk about it comfortably. But it's been a long time coming at this point, since the theory changes kicked in about 5 or 6 years ago, like I said. And it's really just about getting out there and talking to people like this to point out that it's important to understand it and start getting to the next stage.
All right. Well, folks on the line, we do have time for some more questions, so go ahead and send them in. I'm going to talk for a few minutes, give you a chance to do that. Thanks to Erica and thanks to Brian for joining us today. Thank you all for tuning in. This is going to be the last OEM COG webinar of 21, but we do expect to get back with you guys in 2022 with some more OEM related content in the cost world. And once again, if you want a copy of these slides and you want to share the recording of today's webinar with anyone, head on over to www.iceaonline.com/OEMCOG around this time tomorrow, and we will have those up for you. I'm going to give last call to questions, and I will also say, Erica, do you have anything you want to say before we go?
Nothing specific, just thank you all for tuning in. And if you have any questions on inflation and escalation or policy in general, you'll have my contact information and feel free to reach out anytime.
Oh, here we go. Quick last one came in from Brent. Since CAPE estimates typically rely on historical databases, how does CAPE plan to reflect future cost savings from digital transformation and similar initiatives?
So I would say for any kind of cost estimate, historical data is the starting point. There are definitely some huge shifts in technology where we don't have historical data to go on. I guess it really just depends on what kind of change you're talking about. I don't know specifically for the digital question here because I haven't encountered that on any of my estimates so far. But for something that's really brand new, we would talk to engineers and get, usually that's where subject matter expert inputs come in when we'll say things like, you know, how much more complicated is this than how you used to do it? And we might only get something like, oh, it's 25% more complicated. And you can put a cost factor into your estimate if that's all you have to go on. We like to have more data-driven information when we're putting cost estimates together, but it's just not always possible. And so, like I said earlier, a lot of cost estimating comes down to just documenting the assumptions that we make and explaining where we got our data from. And if we have to give information to a decision maker that's based on somebody's guesstimate of complexity, then we'll say that. And you know, there's a lot of risk in this because it's a brand new technology, et cetera. As long as we're communicating to the decision makers everything that we know and kind of laying out that story, that's really what our role is.
All right, and we did get one more. I think we have time for this. There's been a suggestion that when a program goes to multi-year procurement, that they should continue to solicit annual RFPs to help prove out the savings. Is that something CAPE is looking at?
I have not heard that specifically. I'm actually working on my first ever encounter with multi-year procurement right now, and that hasn't come up in the one that I'm working on. So I'm not sure about that.
Okay. Well then, once again, I think we'll call it for now. Give everybody a few minutes to get acclimated or ready for their next meeting. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Greg, for your introduction today. Thanks everybody for joining us. We, the OEM COG, will hear from you in 2022. Everybody have a great rest of your day, rest of your year, and stay safe and sane out there. Thank you all so much.